For gamers on a budget, second-hand computer components are often the best way of getting maximum performance for the price. But these days, the used market is getting more and more relevant. It's not quite as simple as finding any old CPUs, GPUs, motherboards and RAM and slapping them together, however. If you want to play modern games, particularly the more well-known titles, chances are that older components don't perform as well as you'd hope. Between the realms of ridiculously expensive brand new components and obsolete e-waste, there's a pretty big middle ground, and I'm going to help you navigate it. Let's start with the existential question first and foremost. Is buying used even the right choice for you? Honestly, not always. For example, the AMD Vega 64 was an upper-tier graphics card in 2017, and if you have access to AliExpress, or you have a pretty healthy local eBay or equivalent marketplace, you can buy one for less than the cost of a brand new RX 6500 XT or GTX 1630. In almost every scenario, the Vega will outperform a similarly priced new GPU, and it even has more VRAM, which is becoming more important these days. Sounds like a no-brainer, right? Well, AliExpress is based in China, and most of their warehouses are there too, so depending on where you are in the world, you may find that import taxes can be prohibitively high. Not everyone's comfortable buying from AliExpress, especially as their sellers don't always give off particularly trustworthy vibes. Maybe you live in a country that doesn't have a strong second-hand market of its own, and so the Vega 64 still costs way more than all these Anglophone YouTubers say they do. So for some people, buying new is literally the only option. For everyone else, it might still be the right one. The Vega 64, straight out of the box, uses in excess of 200 watts of power all by itself. Older graphics cards can be more powerful than newer ones, sure, but most of them achieve that power by drawing a lot more electricity. This not only means you need a better PSU with a higher output and possibly more external connectors, but the actual cost of using an older, higher consumption GPU can mean you end up paying as much as a more efficient new one over time, or possibly even more. But okay, say you don't need to worry about the running costs, and you have a healthy used market around you, and you're not put off by the risks associated with buying used hardware. You should buy used, right? It should be as simple as that, but it's not. You see, there's a lot of used GPUs out there. Too many, in fact, due to several instances of graphics cards being used as monopoly money generators over the last decade, including a pretty severe example a couple of years ago. GPU production exceeded demand among regular gamers. Now that the crypto river has started to dry up, people who overinvested in graphics cards during the scalper pandemic are now selling them off, and the amount of competition between them is driving prices down. This has led to the situation we're in now, where Vega 64s and RX 5700 XTs and GTX 10 series are all flooding the market at attractive prices. It's also inspired some creative marketing decisions by the various corps involved. AMD recently made the decision to discontinue driver support for the Vega series of graphics cards, as well as the Polaris cards that preceded it. This type of thing isn't unprecedented. The last driver cull in 2021 killed off GCN 1, 2 and 3 driver support, meaning the R9 and HD 7000 series graphics cards are now incompatible with some games released since then. Even games which do launch on these cards will still have missed out on bug fixes and performance improvements that have come from newer driver releases. Vega only just lost driver support, so there won't be many examples yet of games which cause it problems, but it's only a matter of time. Happily, there's a solution in the form of Nime's drivers. These are custom versions of the latest official AMD drivers, modified to work with incompatible older GPUs, and with other customization options to allow features like smart access memory that wouldn't otherwise be supported. As far as I know, these drivers are being made by a solo developer, so their continued availability is only guaranteed for as long as they're committed to the project. Using them is also an act of trust on your part. Allowing custom drivers to be installed on your system isn't a risk-free endeavour, and you don't get the same kind of technical support as you would with official ones. Alas, there's no such modded drivers for older GeForces. Like AMD, Team Green occasionally halts driver development on older GPUs, and at the time of writing that means GPUs built on Kepler are stuck using drivers from 2021. Maxwell and newer GPUs are still supported, meaning there are current official drivers available for graphics cards dating back as far as 2014. However, Nvidia could terminate support for the GTX 900 series at any time, and frankly, based on past behaviour, they're past due. Drivers are part of the stick approach to controlled obsolescence, punishing owners of old tech for not upgrading. The carrot approach means enticing you with attractive new features that are exclusive to newer products, and both AMD and Nvidia have been working on some tasty orange veggies to tempt you away from the new market. Nvidia is most noteworthy for this. In 2018 they launched RTX, a new product segment that featured two highlight technologies, deep learning supersampling and ray tracing. RT is a visual enhancement that can be used to create more accurate lighting, shadows and reflections, and in some games can even be used for sound. RT isn't available on most GTX cards or AMD cards before the RX 6000 series. However, even most of the GPUs that can trace rays don't do it very well. Nvidia has a new enhancement to ray tracing as part of DLSS 3.5 to increase quality and performance. However, as part of that carrot strategy I was talking about, that is exclusive to Nvidia's RTX cards. So far, however, RT's been optional in pretty much every game it was a part of, and anyone with an older GPU can simply live without it and enjoy higher frame rates instead. DLSS, however, has a more universal appeal. It was, as far as I can tell, originally intended to offset the performance hit caused by ray tracing, but it's grown into something far bigger than that. Deep learning supersampling is part of the RTX feature set, but it works independently of ray tracing. It takes low-resolution visuals and upscales them, using data from previously rendered frames to fill in the blanks. This means you get low-resolution performance at high-resolution levels of quality, at least in theory. In practice, there are limits: visual artifacts, softness and processing overhead to name a few, but on the whole, DLSS is a net positive feature that you need an RTX card to enjoy. Now that a used market full of previous-gen RTX cards is causing Nvidia's sales figures a problem, the GeForce team's solution has been an update to DLSS exclusive to the RTX 40 series: deep learning frame generation. Frame generation is similar to generative AI image apps like Stable Diffusion, except it works in almost real time and uses previously rendered frames rather than text prompts. FG isn't perfect technology and suffers from certain flaws that are basically impossible to compensate for. The fact that FG isn't complete yet makes it easy to dismiss as a passing fad that won't ever replace pure processing horsepower. However, it isn't going away. FrameGen's only going to become more relevant and more refined over time, in much the same way as DLSS and other upscalers have, and once it becomes more commonplace, games will start to use it, and possibly even rely on it. Anyway, enough doom-mongering. There's plenty to be cheerful about the future. DLSS upscaling and frame generation might be proprietary, but the alternative versions from AMD, Intel, and even game devs themselves are more open source and compatible with older GPUs. Ray tracing may be the future of game graphics, but it may not be. Who can tell? Older GPUs might not be compatible with all the shiny new features out there, but they're not completely hopeless. At least, not all of them. And now's the time to discuss which ones. GTX cards from the 700 and 600 series are now over a decade old, and are mostly built on the much maligned Kepler architecture. Kepler owners of the past will tell you that they didn't get a lot of love from Nvidia even when they were still relevant, and those days are now long gone. The vast majority of the GTX 600 and 700 cards are incompatible with the latest DX12 features, and weren't designed to work well in APIs like Vulkan either. Most of the range tops out at 3GB of VRAM, and driver support was ended in 2021, which means there are plenty of games from around that time that either suffer from bugs and performance issues, or just straight up refuse to start. The only exceptions to this are the 3 models of Maxwell 1 cards in the 700 series that still work with modern drivers, but most of the other limitations of Kepler still apply to the GTX 745, 750 and 750 Ti, so I can safely say that these older GPUs are not worth buying anymore. As you can imagine, if the 700 and 600 series cards are facing obsolescence, that doesn't leave much room for the even older 500 and 400 series cards, aka Fermi. These cards were known for their high power consumption in their day, and now that they can be outperformed by integrated graphics, there isn't much to be said for Fermi. For specific applications like retro builds or esports machines in countries where electricity isn't too expensive, there can be arguments made for sticking with a Kepler card, but given the number of better options available, I'm not afraid to say that GTX 700 and earlier series cards are effectively dead. I've already mentioned that the Maxwell 2 cards, sold as the GTX 900 series, are still supported with up-to-date drivers, at least at the time of writing. That isn't the only advantage Maxwell 2 has over Kepler and Maxwell 1. The key feature that keeps this series relevant into 2024 is DX12 feature level support. This is a part of DX12 compatibility, but not the whole thing. Some games which run on DX12 are actually only using DX11 features, hence why they might work just fine on Kepler, but big name releases in the last couple of years are leaning more into DX12 features, and the 900 series can therefore run games that the 700 series simply can't. Maxwell 2's main weakness is VRAM. Among the consumer cards, only the top-end 980 Ti has a vaguely acceptable 6GB frame buffer, with the 980 and 970 having 4GB-ish, and the 960 and 950 mostly available with a mere 2GB. Arguably, even the 980 Ti's bigger frame buffer is kind of irrelevant. You'd have to turn quality down to low and enable FSR upscaling to get close to 60 FPS in many modern games, by which time you'd probably be using less than 4 gigs anyway. Another less obvious flaw in Maxwell 2 is actually driver optimization, or the lack of it. Despite the GTX 900 series still working with the latest drivers, it's up to the developers at Nvidia to make specific game optimizations for specific series of cards, and as Kepler owners can attest, it's not uncommon for Nvidia to sort of give up on older architectures. It's not always clear when this happens, but sometimes it's blindingly obvious. The last time I tested a GTX 900 series card, it needed rolling back to older drivers in Halo Infinite and Guardians of the Galaxy to avoid becoming a slideshow. Buying a 900 series card isn't recommended, but it's also not 100% to be avoided either. For the right price, they still have some relevance in modern gaming and could be considered a good buy. They're also a great choice for retro Windows XP builds for those looking for the ultimate early 2000s PC gaming experience. But don't expect them to hold up too well for the 2020s. After all, Maxwell is next in line for the driver chop. Pascal, aka the GTX 1000 or GTX 10 series, is the most fondly remembered generation of Nvidia graphics cards, and one that's actually quite far from obsolete. I call the GTX 1080 Ti a glorious mistake because it was still so relevant in modern games, even to the point where it can sometimes perform limited ray tracing. Not well, but it can do it. That relevance is in part thanks to being a particularly high-end card for the time. The 1080 Ti was expensive in its day, and it's still selling for $200 or more in some cases, so it's definitely the kind of price category where you might consider saving up the difference and getting yourself a newer model instead. That doesn't mean the rest of the Pascal range isn't worth considering. The GTX 1060, particularly the 6GB version, is actually pretty damn competitive. If you shop around, you should be able to find one for less than $100, and yet it far outperforms the inexplicably expensive GTX 1630 and RX 6400, and has greater compatibility and stability than the entry-level Intel Arc A380. The GTX 1070 actually ticks a lot of boxes for a solid 1080p gaming GPU in AAA games. 8GB of VRAM, performance on par with an RTX 3050, and an asking price not far above $100. I haven't tried the 1070 Ti or 1080 lately, but I dare say they're still holding up pretty well too. There are a couple of bad apples in the series, however. The GT 1030, GTX 1050 and 1050 Ti are, to most intents and purposes, past their prime. The 1030 lacks NVENC, meaning almost any modern integrated graphics are better for streaming or recording gameplay or playing back video, so the 1030 can really only justify its existence for its extra display ports. The 1050 and 1050 Ti were once intended for gaming, but lack the power for all but the lightest weight titles in the 2020s. Only the versions of these cards that can be powered purely through the PCI-Express bus could still be argued to have a place in modern gaming, or at least a very small niche of it. The final issue with the Pascal series is one that I'm sure some of you will have already written in the comments: DX12 Ultimate. DX12.1, as it's also known, is an upgrade from the regular DX12 with some key new features, including mesh shaders, which enable more fine detail in objects with less impact on the GPU. So far, this has only been a notable feature in one game, Alan Wake 2, and thanks to that one specific feature, that game is nigh on unplayable on even the highest end Pascal GPUs. At least, unless you mod the game. There's no certified guarantee that mesh shaders and DX12 Ultimate in general will become more commonplace. Alan Wake 2 is made by Remedy, who use their own in-house Northlight engine that I haven't seen in use anywhere else. There are other systems for generating complex geometry that don't require DX12 Ultimate, like, for example, Nanite within Unreal Engine 5, so it could be that DX12 Ultimate won't become the final nail in Pascal's coffin, but it has acted as a shot across the bow of older GPUs, and I couldn't blame anyone who used it as a reason to disregard GTX 10 series and older altogether. Turing is the last series of Nvidia cards that truly count as previous gen as of the beginning of 2024. Ampere, or RTX 30 series, is still available brand new in some instances. Turing, however, is mostly discontinued. You can still pick up the GTX 1630, 1650 and 1660 series for the time being, but they and the original RTX cards are now officially end of life. They are, however, still pretty competent graphics cards. I haven't tested the whole range, but the 2080 is a pretty compelling alternative to the 3060 Ti, if you can find it for a lower price, and the 2060 and 2060 Super are great value entry-level cards, available for cheaper than most recent cards like the 3060 and 4060, but still having access to modern RTX exclusive features like DLSS and RT Ray reconstruction. You'll miss out on frame generation, but if that's important to you, I'd point out that it's still early days for the technology, and by the time it's matured, maybe you'll be ready to upgrade to a 5060 or whatever. The only real reason to consider avoiding Turing is the alternatives from AMD and Intel. Used RDNA 1 cards and even some RDNA 2 are in a similar price point to the GTX 1660 Supers and TIs, but far outperform them in most cases. But I'll talk more about those cards later. In the meantime, let's look at AMD properly. When the Radeon series flipped from ATI branding to AMD, the current architecture was Terascale. It had a badass name, awesome features, and highly competitive performance per watt. That was a decade and a half ago. The Radeon HD 6000 series cards and older have very little in the way of compatibility with modern games. You can get up-to-date drivers from Nimes, at least for the 6000 series, but official support ended during the Obama administration, and API support ends at DX11. You might get some esports to run on these, but on the whole, you should probably steer clear. The GCN architecture stayed relevant for a lot longer than Terascale. The HD 7000, R200 and even some R300 cards used first-gen GCN for years, and driver support lasted all the way until 2021. However, once more, this series lacked support for DX12 features, so these days the same caveats apply as with Terascale. If you are primarily interested in older games, however, it should be remembered that GCN1 was the arch used in the original 8th gen consoles, so if there's a PS4 or Xbox One era title you want to play on PC, some of the higher end Radeon HD 7000 series are still surprisingly capable. GCN2 is where things start to get interesting. If it weren't for the end of driver support, cards like the R9 290 and 390 would still be viable for budget gaming today. They have incredibly high power consumption relative to their performance, but they support Vulkan and DX12, can use Nime's drivers, and the best of them still perform on par with the entry-level RDNA 2 cards like the RX 6400. The price would have to be pretty low to make these appealing. The used and refurbished markets have been flooded with RX 580 2048s, which have similar performance but lower power consumption and can sell for as little as $50, so ideally for a GCN2 card you'd want to pay less than that. GCN3 was a pretty forgettable generation. The R9 285, 380 and 380X are decent enough, with most of the advantages of GCN2, and are probably about on par with a Steam Deck nowadays. The top-end GCN3s were interesting as curiosities, but seem rare now. The R9 Nano, Fury and Fury X were the first consumer cards to use HBM, but because of the cost of that super fancy VRAM, they only had 4GB of it. The best of them, the Fury X, can match the GTX 1660 for raw performance, but in addition to the lesser VRAM, you'd have to deal with the lack of drivers, higher power consumption, lack of DX 12.1, and the somewhat bizarre decision to use an integrated sealed AIO for cooling. That brings us to Polaris. This was a truncated generation, built on 4th gen GCN architecture and limited to only low to mid-range models, but with 8GB options available at reasonable prices. There's not much point talking about the history of this series because it's been effectively obscured in recent years. GCN4 was part of the push to get VR-capable cards with 8GB frame buffers into the hands of the masses, but the primary audience in recent years was, in fact, Ethereum miners. Apparently, enough X-mining RX 470s, 480s, 570s and 580s had memory issues, broken fans, dead video outputs and other faults that there were enough salvageable GPUs to create an entire cottage industry of dodgy discount brand graphics cards. Considering Polaris's pedigree, it's the GPU that powered the PS4 Pro and Xbox Series X, and prices as low as $50, it's been spectacularly popular for budget gaming. Alas, it's also recently fallen foul of the old discontinued driver trick, so you'll need to download Nime's drivers going forward, but aside from that, the 2304 SP cards are about 80 to 90% of the performance of the RX 6500 XT in most games, and are about the cheapest way of getting an 8GB graphics card. GCN4 doesn't support DX12 Ultimate, but honestly it was never going to run Alan Wake 2 anyway. With those caveats aside, there's still a lot to like about Polaris. The original launch of Vega, in the form of the 56 and 64, is somewhat contentious, but in my opinion still has a lot going for it. As I mentioned in the first section of this video, the Vega 64 beats most entry-level cards on the market, has 8GB of VRAM, and potentially more thanks to the high bandwidth cache controller, and in general it's just really great value. The Vega 56 does almost all of that, and can be found even cheaper. It has the same downsides as the rest of the GCN lineup: lack of drivers, which can be circumvented, lack of DX12 Ultimate, which can't, but on the whole, Vega's still pretty awesome in 2024. So what's contentious about it? Well, AMD cards in general have a reputation for poor reliability. Now, I don't know if that's true. I've never had a Radeon fail on me. and certain parts of the enthusiast community aren't above a bit of muckraking, so it's not always possible to separate the truth from the fiction. Anyway, Vega's reputation in this area is worse than average. All Radeons of the GCN 4 and 5 era have a higher than average chance of being ex-mining cards, and so the failure rate of these is going to be pretty high. If you're the sort of person who likes to buy cards, use them and then resell them, this might not be the right choice for you. Otherwise, some of the Vega heatsinks are quite handsome, so if you like keeping old GPUs as objet d'art, maybe pick one up for the hell of it. The footnote at the end of GCN 5 was version 5.1 in the form of the Radeon 7. For a while there were a few of these available on AliExpress for decent prices, but they seem to have sold out, and the used market for these is pretty horrendous. The Radeon 7 is a decent performer, matching or exceeding the GTX 1080 Ti in many titles, but also exceeding it in price. The 16GB of HBM and, again, HBCC for stretching the VRAM even further, should make it appealing in modern games. Apparently though, it also makes it appealing for stable diffusion, so until that particular bubble pops, it seems like the 7 will be out of reach for most people. I have to eat some humble pie on this one. I've been unequivocal on my recommendation for the RX 5000 series GPUs this year. The RX 5500 XT is a stellar buy at under $100. The RX 5700 XT is insanely good value at under $150. And the only downside I could speak of was the 6GB frame buffer of the 5600 XT. Since then, however, my RDNA recommendation hasn't died down, but I do have to offer a couple of caveats. Sub 8GB cards are going to be more limited than I originally assumed, and the lack of DX12 Ultimate support means that at least one game won't work very well at all. Still, that aside, if you can live with these limitations, you still can't find a consistently better buy on the used market right now. So, that's 7 pages of script that's taken about 42 minutes to read out so far, and I haven't even got onto CPUs yet. Thankfully, in the interest of making life easier for both you and me, I can make a few sweeping statements to narrow things down. First of all, CPUs might not have drivers as such, but operating systems can make older CPUs obsolete. If you intend on using Windows 11, the official compatibility CPU list starts with Intel's 8th generation Coffee Lake and AMD's Zen Plus 2000 series. There are workarounds to get older generations working in Windows 11, which I have no personal experience of. I like my workaround. It's called Stick with Windows 10. Most of the CPUs I recommend use either PCI-Express version 3 or 4. Practically speaking, so long as your X16 graphics cards are plugged into X16 slots, there's little or no bottleneck caused by Gen 3 compared to Gen 4. However, if you're looking to pair a modern GPU with an older CPU and motherboard, that can cause an issue. Some new cards only have X8 or even X4 bandwidth. Also, some CPUs only work with Gen 3 PCIe, even when installed on a Gen 4 motherboard, and the opposite can also be true. A Gen 4 capable CPU like a Ryzen 3000 series will only work at Gen 3 speeds on a B450 or X370 motherboard. To avoid bottlenecks, I recommend only using modern X4 and X8 graphics cards with fully Gen 4 enabled systems. If you have a Gen 3 CPU or motherboard, I suggest sticking with X16 graphics cards. CPUs have headline features like the number of physical and virtual cores, the amount of level 1, 2, 3 and sometimes even level 4 cache, and of course, clock speeds. There's much more to them than that, but many features that get added over time aren't quite as obvious. Those with long enough memories might remember the marketing campaigns around Intel's MMX, but these days extensions like AVX2 and 512 are more likely to get a footnote in the press release. AVX has been around since the days of Intel Sandy Bridge, with AVX2 being added for Haswell. AVX2 has a notable performance difference in some games, and others require it. For this reason, I don't recommend CPUs without AVX2 anymore. For me, Intel 3rd Gen and earlier shouldn't be considered by anyone for gaming in the 2020s. On the subject of CPUs that shouldn't be considered by anyone, AMD. Specifically, any AMD CPU for the AM3, FX2 or earlier sockets. I know many people will have fond memories of the FX range. Models like the FX 6300 and 8320 still have their stands, and it can be argued that they offer decent value when compared to their contemporaries, but these days their price, performance and running costs just don't make sense in a post-Ryzen world. And staying on the subject of Ryzen, AMD's first and second gen Ryzen CPUs have always been very much productivity focused, and as such, they're not ideal for gaming. If you have one in your system right now and don't want or can't afford to upgrade, but want to use it for gaming, you'll find you'll have a better experience with it paired to an AMD Radeon GPU, owing to lower driver overhead. If you run games on a CPU with lower single-core performance and a GeForce card, Nvidia's drivers use enough of your CPU's resources that it can have a severe impact on performance. I made a video testing the Ryzen 7 1700X with a Radeon RX 6700 and GeForce RTX 3070, which should demonstrate the difference, and it's linked in the description. The Ryzen 3000 series was really when AMD started to shine, and the 3600, 3700X, 3900X and 3950X are all still fairly viable in 2024. The only problem for these Zen 2 chips is that Zen 3 exists. Any motherboard that can accept a 3000 series CPU can also work with a 5000 series, and they are currently the high watermark for gaming performance on a budget. The 3600 and 3700X might be worth picking up if the price is right, but the 5600 and 5700X are very well priced and will perform better in esports titles and other CPU limited use cases than even the top-end Ryzen 9 from the previous generation. There are a couple of models of Zen 2 CPU branded as the 4000 series. Despite their names, these are cut-down versions of the 3000 series equivalents, with smaller caches and reduced PCIe bandwidth. This makes sense when you realise they're originally APUs with the integrated graphics cutoff, but if you didn't know that, then it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. AMD had a range of CPUs with built-in Vega graphics, usually referred to as APUs. AMD cocked up the naming on these, so the 2200G and 2400G are actually on the 1000 series architecture, the 3200G and 3400G are on 2000 series, and so forth. Those integrated GPUs were and are pretty impressive performers, but only in very specific circumstances. I like them in micro form factor PCs like the Lenovo M75Q and the ASRock X300, where any other internal graphics would be impossible and an external GPU would be too unwieldy to install. However, given the recent Vega driver situation and the weaker architectures, I can't recommend the 2000 or 3000 series APUs. The 4000 and 5000 series APUs are on 3000 and 5000 series architectures respectively, so they certainly work better as CPUs, but they also have smaller L3 caches and lack Gen 4 PCI-Express. Okay, so I'm a Zen 3 fan, I admit it. I've used the 5600X and 5700X in my personal rig and my GPU test rig, and I remain impressed by just how much value Zen 3 offers over 3 years after its initial release. Of course, AMD can't help but shoot themselves in the foot, so some of the 5000 series aren't quite up to snuff. The Ryzen 5 5500 and 5700 are, once more, cut down APUs with the graphics removed, and so have smaller L3 caches and Gen 3 PCIe. The smaller cache will affect performance somewhat, but if you intend to use an X16 graphics card, then these aren't terrible. But in my opinion, they'd have to be a hell of a lot cheaper than a 5600 or 5700X to be worth considering. And of course, I should mention the X3D chips. The 5800X3D never really had a price drop in the UK, and the 5600X3D was a US exclusive, so I've never been able to pick one up for a good price. But they are legendarily good gaming CPUs. Technically, a new Zen 4 or Intel Raptor Lake CPU should be better, but considering the 5800X3D can work on a 7-year-old motherboard with dirt cheap DDR4 RAM, there's no wonder it's so popular. If you were thinking of upgrading your first or second gen Ryzen to a 7000 series, this might be worth considering before you go buying a whole new platform. While Intel desktop CPUs from the 4th through 7th generations aren't doing too badly, especially for esports and other lighter weight titles, there's a few limits that can't really be overcome, and which are going to hold you back in a lot of newer games. Those being the lack of cores and cache. Intel famously stuck to the 2 and 4 core format for the first 4 generations of desktop Core series CPUs, and while the argument at the time was that more than 4 cores was a waste for gaming, that certainly doesn't hold true today. Haswell and Skylake can be had quite inexpensively, so the i7s on these platforms still have some utility. But Kaby Lake is horrendously expensive for little or no improvement in games, and Broadwell, while offering the novelty of a 128MB SD-RAM pool which can be leveraged as an L4 cache, also fetches ridiculously high prices. On the other hand, at least for Haswell and Broadwell, the Xeon equivalent chips do turn up for some very attractive prices compared to their i7 counterparts, so it may be that owners of older systems could get a sizable upgrade for a relatively low cost. Check out the Intel Arc website or Tech Power-Up's CPU database to find the model number that works for you, then pop it into eBay or AliExpress to see if any of them are affordable. Continuing on the topic of Xeons, the current trend of large socket E5s with more cores than the desktop i7s of the day actually makes a lot of sense. A Haswell Xeon with 8 cores might not match a quad-core with higher clock speeds in Valorant or CS2, but it will match or beat them in more multi-threaded games like Cyberpunk and The Last of Us, and what's more, it costs a fraction of the price. You can get extremely capable E5 Xeons for under $20, and some for under $10. There are downsides, of course. You knew there would be, right? The numbering scheme is extremely hard to get your head around, and I can't go into it in too much depth because this video is already too long, but here goes. The E5 Xeons were available for 4 generations, from the original Sandy Bridge to Ivy Bridge V2s, Haswell V3s, and Broadwell V4s. Sandy and Ivy bridges are on socket 2011, most commonly found on X79 series motherboards. You should ignore this platform. Like desktop Sandy and Ivy, you're lacking AVX2 and stuck with DDR3 RAM, and frankly, it all costs too much now compared to the later models. Those being Haswell V3 and Broadwell V4. These are socket 2011 V3 CPUs which use X99 motherboards and mostly DDR4 RAM. If you're looking for a CPU to match with a genuine X99 board, most likely from one of the well-known marques like Asus, MSI or Gigabyte, consider the Haswell 1600 V3s first. The 6 and 8 core models have unlocked multipliers and are close to the i7 5930K and 5960X in performance. 2000 V3 series CPUs don't have unlocked multipliers, but often have more cores and are cheaper. Plus, if you use a board from a lesser known brand bought on AliExpress, they can perform a turbo unlock mod to boost all core frequencies higher than their rating. For more information on E5 Xeons, I have a few videos, but I suggest you check out Mirkonst Hardware's channel, as he's YouTube's resident Xeon guy. From the 8th generation, Intel began to offer more cores than they'd previously brought to desktop, while retaining their single-thread superiority. That means CPUs like the i7-8700K, i9-9900K and others are still extremely competitive today, often surpassing AMD 3000 series and coming close to the 5000 series in some games. Alas, for some reason, they've held a disproportionate amount of value on the used market, and in some cases cost as much as, or more than the more recent CPUs. It needs to be pointed out that, from a practical standpoint, these CPUs are not worth anywhere near as much as Ryzen 5000. The AM4 platform includes motherboards that can still be bought brand new, and which support modern features like resizable bar and PCI-Express version 4. While most Intel Z370 and 390 boards can be updated to add rebar support, PCIe 4 didn't get added until the 11th gen Z590 series motherboards, and that will potentially harm GPU performance, especially if you're shopping for more recent graphics cards with X4 or X8 connectivity. I don't have much personal experience with 10th or 11th gen core series, but on paper some of them still look promising. They are only minor refinements over the 8th and 9th gen, which isn't a bad thing, but I wouldn't consider an i5 10600K to be an upgrade over an i7 8700K, nor is an i7 10700K an upgrade over the i9 9900K. For gamers, 11th gen's only real practical benefit over 10th is the addition of PCIe 4. However, video editors and people with similar requirements might like the 11th gen's enhanced iGPUs. The Rocket Lake chips have the same hardware encoding and decoding capabilities as later 12th, 13th and 14th gen CPUs, which actually make them a bit more versatile for video playback, even if you have a high-end modern graphics card. The brand new market for CPUs and GPUs is outside of the scope, not just of this video, but of my channel. Sorry folks, nobody sends me components to review yet. However, I have tested Intel 12th and 13th gen processors and AMD 7000 series CPUs in mini PCs, and frankly, I've been blown away. Granted, I haven't seen how they work in a real gaming environment, but in everyday computing and productivity, they are extremely compelling. A modern i5 costs £200 all by itself, and while my inner cheapskate would like to point out that you could almost buy a whole PC for that, you could also spend £200 or more on a previous gen i7 or i9. The thing is, 12th and 13th gen are such a leap above previous generation architectures that the i5s for the LGA 1700 socket will perform better in many situations, will offer better efficiency for everyday computing, and have a bigger, if still depressingly curtailed, upgrade path. AMD has a similar issue. While, in my opinion, Zen 3 is still the best value series for budget builders, especially those who don't need maximum CPU performance, the top-end CPUs like the Ryzen 9 5950X and Ryzen 7 5800X3D are so expensive they don't make much sense when equal or superior 7000 series are available for similar prices. The overall platform costs are, of course, higher when considering AM5. B650 boards are generally more expensive than B550. DDR5 is getting cheaper, but so is DDR4. So you'd have to evaluate for yourself whether buying into a great value discontinued platform like Zen 3 is worth losing all future upgrade options for. Should you buy used components in 2024? In terms of graphics cards, the answer is an emphatic yes, mostly. Sure, the latest and greatest GPUs from AMD and Nvidia have features that are absent from previous generations, and VRAM is finally being made available in reasonable amounts, but on the whole, the current generation doesn't have an enticing enough carrot to make them desirable, and DX12 Ultimate and discontinued drivers haven't yet proven to be a scary enough stick. CPUs are a different story. For as long as Zen 3 and Alder Lake are still available brand new, they will dominate a price point that would otherwise be filled with older, high-end CPUs. Until the used market readjusts to allow for chips like the i3 12100, i5 12400, Ryzen 5 5600 and Ryzen 7 5700X, most CPUs from the last 5 years or so will continue to look like poor value. On the other hand, the extreme budget end of the market is being catered to by some very enticing Xeons, which, if you can get past the need for sketchy motherboards, offer excellent value for money and help counter the trend towards higher cores and threads. Hopefully that's been useful for you. I've got plenty of CPU reviews lined up for 2024, including my first ever Ryzen 7000 series CPU, the 7500F, which at under £150 from AliExpress is looking like a real star buy for gamers. I've only got a couple of used GPUs in the pipeline so far, so let me know which older cards you'd like to see me revisit in the coming year. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time. My god, that took a long time. Holy shit, over an hour and 10 minutes. Jesus fuck.